Hello everyone, it's Monday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. Washington recently removed South Korea from its currency manipulation watch list for the first time in 7 years. The removal came due to the country's downturn in its trade performance and its maintenance of a net selling stance against the dollar to defend the value of the Korean won. Experts have been slowly recovering, though, on the back of rising demand for semiconductors and vehicles. Led by the moderate rise in exports, the local economy is also expected to grow alongside this. However, experts say external conditions and unwaning inflation could make Seoul experience a delay in a full recovery. How do experts see South Korea's current economy? For this, we invited Professor Kim Yong-jin from Sogang Business School. Welcome, Professor Kim.
Good evening.
Good evening. And we also have Professor Hwagyun Kim from the Mays Business School at Texas A&M University. Good to see you again, Professor Kim.
Always pleasure.
Thank you for being with us. Now, as both professors' last names are the same, I ask for their understanding in calling them by their given names. Now, first question to our Professor Yong-jin. Let's first start with South Korea's removal from a currency manipulation watch list by the U.S. government. Before we tap into the specifics, why does the U.S. have such a watch list, and what are the criteria for a country to put on the list?
All right. Now, before we get to the point, let's think about the role of foreign exchange rate, which is the comparative price between countries. If one country intentionally lowered the value of their money, then they may have advantage over the other trade partners because their price of product or services gets cheaper. This is an unfair trade practice. So to prevent this kind of unfair trade practice happening, the U.S. government has been using the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act of 2015, which took effect in February 2016 as a tool to monitor its partner who trades substantially with the United States and intervene in current stability beyond a certain threshold. Here's the process. After the U.S. Treasury evaluate the macroeconomic and exchange rate policies of its top 20 trade partners biannually, if some countries meet certain criteria, it designate them as either a watch list country or a country under in-depth analysis. The criteria include, number one, a trade surplus with the U.S. of over $15 billion. Number two, a current account surplus over 3% of its GDP. And number three, foreign exchange authority net purchase of the U.S. dollars in defense of the currency rate exceeding 2% of their GDP, and engagement in such interventions for 8 or more months over the last 12 months. Any country that meets two of the criteria is put on the watch list, and a country meeting all three is put in the in-depth analysis group.
All right, I see. So Washington's such listing is to restrict an unfair trade practice. Now, Professor Hwagyun, like I said before, South Korea recently has been taken off the watch list, which is the first time since February 2016. Why the removal?
So as just pointed out well and explained well by Professor Kim, this removal reflects a change in the economic indicators that are related to this criteria. So the first, in terms of trade surplus, Korea still has significant trade surplus, about $38 billion, which is above the threshold. So this one still meets the criterion. And then the second one, the current account surplus, as we know, in January in 2023, we had a big deficit, and then that contributed negatively. So the 3% rule of the GDP, now the current account surplus dropped to about 0.5%, and therefore now this one's gone. And then the third one is the intervention. So in case of Korea, as we know, the currency has been devalued a bit, and to remove this type or reduce this type of things, the Korean government has been the net seller of the US dollar, right? So this one also is not applying to this the condition. Therefore, now we only have one condition here. Therefore, the Korea no longer aligns with the criteria set by the US for the purpose of this, the monitoring the currency manipulation.
All right, I see. Well, Professor Hwagyun, thank you for pointing out the reasons why South Korea was excluded from the list. Then, Professor Yong-jin, what are the benefits we would be able to see following South Korea's removal?
Yeah, and it is really good news, right? The removal from the watch list. But I don't think, it is only good news because, there is some adverse effect, we have, performance of export. Anyway, the removal from the list will give, some sort of benefits. First of all, the restriction of U.S. Corporate investment in Korea will be lifted. So, Korea may enjoy more investment from U.S. Companies. Secondly, the U.S. Trade Department will not oversee when Korea authorities implement a new foreign exchange policies. Thirdly, Korea may have, a good reputation as a transparent, foreign exchange policy.
All right, I see. So the removal could give the country some benefits, but as our Professor Yong-jin briefly mentioned, it cannot be all good as it indicates downturn in exports and won's depreciation. So Professor Hwagyun, we are going to talk about decline in exports, but before that, some reports say this exposed the country's reduced foreign exchange reserves as well. The figure was at around $412 billion as of the end of last month, the lowest amount in 40 months since June 2020. Should we be worried about this?
Well, the short answer is less likely, but still we need to caution a bit on certain side because this is a simple economics in a sense. Because we used to have about $470 billion in foreign reserves. Although it depends on how you calculate things, but that means you have like this 460, say, to about 412. So it's about negative 50. So about a little bit over 10% of this foreign reserve just disappeared in about a year period, which is about slightly over 10%, right? So if that happens, then what potentially is a problematic, I think, is because Korea has to import raw materials. When you import raw materials, you have to pay with the US dollar or some of the foreign currencies that they want. And if we don't have liquidity provided, then I think we will have difficulty, the investing or purchasing these kind of things to produce goods that we can export, right? So that's one issue. And second, more financial stability context. We have a lot of short-term debt. It's not too bad, but still we have a little bit of high short-term debt. And the short-term debt, especially in foreign currency denomination, if that's still really increasing in the short term, then the rollover risk is going to increase. Meaning, because it's a short term, which it has like 1 year or less of the maturity, if a lot of things have to be paid back in US dollar or euros and other things, and if we don't have enough foreign reserves, that's going to be a concern. So we have enough, and I don't think IMF or other, the international the agencies show concerns, but still I think it's a good idea to manage the short-term debt.
All right, I see. So there's no need to worry about it too much, but we still need to be cautious about it. I see, Professor Hwagyun. Well, Professor Yong-jin, we also need to take a look at the decline in exports as well. After a sharp decline, it is showing a slow recovery, with South Korea logging a current account surplus for the 5th straight month in September. However, this is reportedly because of a sharper drop in imports. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. Korea's exports have recovered from a year of stagnant growth due to improvement in semiconductor sector and export to China, as you mentioned. With increase in export and drop in import, Korea recorded a trade surplus of $1.64 billion in October, which is a 5th straight gain from June. It is also the first time in 20 months since February last year for the Korean economy to record a gain in export and trade surplus at the same time. The trade surplus was partly contributed, by lower energy prices, which is the most important import for Korean economy. Import of crude oil increased by 0.1% on a year, while the inbound shipment of other energy products such as gas and coals dropped by 54.3% and 26.1% respectively.
All right, I see. Well, now I'd like to delve a little bit deeper into where South Korean exports end up. So, Professor Hwagyun, reports say the destination of South Korean exports is changing, and according to the Korea Chamber and Industry, outbound shipments to Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and Central Asia are increasing. But what is the reason behind this?
Well, it's not that easy to pinpoint, of course, but then at least as we talked about before briefly, I think this is somewhat impressive in that because we talked about this difficulty of the decreasing export, and then at that time we talked about diversifying trading partners. And I'm sure that firms and as well as the government have been making lots of effort to do that, but it's not that easy to divert trading partners all of a sudden from like China, Japan, US to the all other countries. But still, I think the Korean government, as well as, of course, the firms really push hard, I think, just to find places to sell their products. And that's, I think, where things are getting better, especially when we still have some lagged delays, effects actually from the major trading partners, especially China. So I think this is a result of a big effort, and probably because of also some of the, the expanding the FTA, like free trading agreements and other types of the MOUs and also the promotions related to the energy and defense sectors, which have been the new sort of the territory for exports. Right, so overall, I think it's pretty good news, right?
Right, I cannot agree more. I mean, it's really nice to hear that South Korea has diversified its trading partners, but Professor Yong-jin, exports to China, Southeast Asia, and Japan declined. Why is this so?
Yeah, that's right. But it is quite complicated issue, because the dynamics among these, China, Japan, and Southeastern countries and Korea has been changed. When it comes to China, the export to China decreased for 18 consecutive months since May 2022. However, a good thing is that in October, export to China reached $11 billion. This is the third consecutive months. They were over $10 billion since August. The rate of decline in export to China slowed to minus 9.5% in October. But anyway, there are two main reasons for this decline. First one is that Chinese-made intermediate goods, which is, our main export items, gain a competitive advantage over Korean ones. So the international division of labor between South Korea and China has weakened, and competition with China has also been intensifying in overseas and also Chinese market. The second reason is that the decline in the Chinese construction industry as well as consumption. According to the Korea Development Institute, a 10% decline in Chinese construction industry production would translate into 0.4% decrease in South Korea's gross domestic product, GDP, due to the decrease in export of intermediate goods to the Chinese market, including construction materials and chemicals and metal products. When it comes to Southeast Asia, Vietnam is the largest trade partner of Korea, is experiencing economic downturn too. And even more, Korean companies lose their ground in Vietnam due to the competition with Chinese companies. Vietnam has been regarded as an alternative market to the Chinese market by many South Korean exporters of intermediate goods. While South Korea's market share of Vietnam's intermediate goods import has been falling since hitting its peak of 24.8% in 2017, China's has been rising steeply over the same period. Okay, lastly, with Japan, Korea has a similar problem, just like China and with China and Japan. Both nations offer very similar product on the global market. The recent depreciation of the yen, Japanese yen, gives Japanese product and services a pricing edge to pose a challenge to Korean industries like automobile and steel, which faces strong export competition with Japan.
All right, I see. So to sum up, the difficulties the global economy is facing, Chinese goods increased competitiveness and depreciation of yen all contributed to the decrease in exports to such countries. I see. Well, apart from that, some experts say severe external conditions such as a global economic slowdown due to high interest rates could affect the country's exports overall. So, Professor Hwagyun, to what extent should South Korea brace for the impact?
Well, the high interest rate mainly comes from the high inflation, partly because of expected inflation just jacking up the interest rate. But at the same time, monetary policy calls for the higher interest rate. So higher interest rate, especially if the price is kind of sticky in the short term, then it's going to reduce the investments and things like that. And also it's going to have some negative impacts on exports. So to this type of shocks, how firms and households respond to these kind of things depend on, of course, the existing resource, which is like savings, and then also how the households and firms can finance consumption and investment during this kind of difficult time. And the third, of course, to help this, the short-term stabilization policy can be helpful. But in this case, the third option is not very feasible because we already are trying to deflate, right? So the policy is already implemented. Actually, that is the result of the higher interest rates. So the third option is gone. Therefore, we have to rely on the higher savings, especially in the foreign currency terms, and then also the way to finance consumption and the investment, meaning you have to have some ways to externally finance things, which is not that easy. So given that it's related to the foreign reserve, the question that we talked about, we have to increase the foreign reserves a bit. And also we have to keep looking at the longer term financing options because the shorter term actually financing is going to be somewhat dangerous. So that I think is going to be the thing. And we probably have to prepare a bit, although I don't worry too much, again, because export is actually now in a recovery mode. So probably a quarter or two of the period is going to be the South Korean, the firms and government actually have to be very careful.
All right, I see. Well, thank you for your advice, Professor Hwagyun. Now, up until now, we have been talking about exports. And Professor Yong-jin, though the local economy will show a gradual recovery backed by the exports next year, the pace is reportedly going to be limited due to the slowdown in domestic consumption growth. Could you give us a specific figure and why so sluggish?
Yeah, as you mentioned, the Korean economy shows a gradual recovery backed by export. However, the pace is very limited due to the slowdown in domestic consumptions. So soaring prices of daily items is one reason. People have suffers, from that, high everyday price. They do not want to shop. And while high interest made small business owners and young people hesitant to start new business, and consumers won't spend much. But in Korea, they only want to purchase house. Household debts are up to about $2 trillion, which is greater than the nation's GDP. Which in turn limit the consumption expenses because people do not have money to spend, and repaying their debt. When the interest rate increases, it will be shrinking further to curb the economic recovery. The economic growth for the next year is expected only to be low 2%. So this is, the situation we have at the moment.
Right, I see. So high inflation seems to be one of the major issues behind this slowdown in domestic consumption growth. But Professor Hwagyun, experts say inflation is not going to wane anytime soon. Why is this so?
Well, the textbook sort of explanation for inflation is demand-driven or supply-driven. The demand means like people just try to demand more goods, therefore the price goes up. I don't think this is the case for now, and it's more supply reasons, meaning the product's prices, cost of the producing things are going up, especially because we have to rely a lot on imports. And that actually is more supply-sided, the cost, pushing inflation. And as you know, the global situation is not very good, especially like oil price, et cetera. So that I think has the very slow effects. And also when this happens, the expectation actually can augment this speed of inflation, meaning, well, because we expect the price is going to go up because of cost, maybe we have to buy it like earlier, and that actually has some secondary demand effects. So I think, this part actually has to go down, and to do so, clearly some of the cost reasons have to be gone, and that probably takes time, and that's actually why it's sluggish.
I see. Now, Professor Yong-jin, I believe this will be our very last question, but all things considered, what should South Korea's macroeconomic policy be? I mean, what rate decision do you believe the BOK will have to make during its next rate-setting meeting at the end of this month?
Well, me go first? Mm-hmm. I mean, you have to ask that question to the president of BOK. As everybody knows, export is the most important economic growth factor for a Korean economy. So the Korean government need to focus more on promoting, export by supporting businesses, to build their R&D capabilities and global capabilities. Otherwise, there is no way for us to, make, foreign markets ours. And also, Korean government need to strengthen the ties with new markets like ASEAN countries and India, African countries. Most importantly, Korean government need to put effort, on reducing household debt, which absolutely limit our, consumption growth. For this, Bank of Korea have to seriously think, to raise the benchmark interest rate, although it will come with much suffering in the private sector.
Right, I see. Well, I'd like to ask for Professor Hwagyun's opinion as well, but unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. Thank you, Professor Yong-jin and Professor Hwagyun, for your time and insights. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure.
Thank you. All right, that's all for Within the Frame tonight. We'll be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.